WWE legend Ric Flair diagnosed with skin cancer at 76. Heartbreaking backstage update. Wrestling fans, this is not the kind of news we ever wanted to hear. Ric Flair, the Nature Boy himself, has been diagnosed with skin cancer at age 76. In this emotional update, we dive into what really happened backstage at WWE, how Flair is coping, and what this could mean for his future in wrestling. Under the bright lights and roaring chants of WWE arenas, Ric Flair was always larger than life. The Nature Boy wasn't just a nickname, it was a symbol of untouchable greatness. For decades, he strutted down the ramp with unmatched confidence, his golden robes flowing behind him, the unmistakable "whoa" echoing across generations of fans. But today, in a grim twist that nobody expected, the wrestling world is grappling with devastating news. Ric Flair, at 76 years old, has been diagnosed with skin cancer. This isn't just a health scare. It's a moment that has shaken WWE to its emotional core. And the heartbreaking details of what happened backstage have left those closest to him in stunned silence. It all began quietly, far from the public eye, in a backstage hallway at a recent WWE Raw taping. Ric Flair, now a respected elder statesman of the sport, had shown up unannounced, not for an angle or a surprise appearance, but just to say hello. It was supposed to be a casual visit, a reunion with old friends, a chance to embrace a family that had watched him bleed, rise, fall, and fight again over the course of half a century. But those smiles quickly turned to hushed whispers. Flair didn't look well. The glimmer in his eyes had dimmed. He was slower than usual, wincing beneath his sunglasses, his skin pale, thinner than ever. Some assumed it was just the wear of age, the long nights and miles his body had endured. But there was more. According to backstage sources, Flair confided in a few close allies, legends like Shawn Michaels and Triple H, that he'd recently undergone a series of tests after noticing an unusual spot on his shoulder that had changed rapidly. At first, he thought little of it. After all, he was Ric Flair. He had walked through fire and emerged with diamonds. But this time, the fire burned deeper. Doctors confirmed the worst: skin cancer. A melanoma that had already begun to spread. As those words left his lips, even the toughest men in the room could barely keep it together. Word spread through the locker room like wildfire, but quietly, respectfully. This wasn't tabloid fodder. This wasn't a work. This was real. This was Ric Flair, the steal-in, profile-in, limousine ride-in, jet-fly-in icon, standing in the back corridors of WWE, suddenly vulnerable in a way that no storyline could ever capture. He didn't want pity. He didn't want headlines. He just wanted to be around the business that gave him everything while he still could. But even he couldn't hide the weight of what he'd just heard from his doctors. There's a moment, one described by an unnamed WWE staff member, where Flair, sitting on a production crate near gorilla position, looked down at his own hands and whispered, "I've been beat up, broken down, nearly dead before. But this one feels different." It was a sobering thing to hear from a man who once cheated death on multiple occasions, from plane crashes to heart surgeries to comas that nearly claimed him. And yet, somehow, cancer made him feel more mortal than any of it. WWE's medical team, along with trusted confidants, rushed to offer support. Triple H, now a top executive in the company, reportedly pulled Flair into his private office and stayed with him for over an hour. Not as a boss, not as a former rival, but as a friend. The two sat in silence for long stretches, broken only by shared memories, laughter, and a few tears that neither of them tried to hide. Flair asked about the business. Who was next in line? Whether his legacy still mattered. Triple H reportedly looked him in the eye and said, "You're the reason a lot of us are even here. You'll always matter." But the emotion backstage wasn't limited to old-school veterans. Younger stars, people like Cody Rhodes, Seth Rollins, and even Roman Reigns, heard the news and paid quiet visits. Some just nodded. Some hugged him like he was their grandfather. Others broke down. Because for many of them, Ric Flair isn't just a legend on a poster. He's the heartbeat of what wrestling means. He's the reason they put on boots in the first place. And to see him sitting there, frail and facing an uncertain future, was a gut punch that shook even the most hardened performers. As the hours passed, WWE production made the decision not to film any segments involving Flair that night. Not out of disrespect, but out of reverence. Out of care. Out of sheer emotion. One senior producer was heard saying, "Tonight just didn't feel right. We weren't going to make a spectacle out of this. He's family. We needed to be there for him, not turn him into a headline." And that was the tone of the night. Quiet. Heavy. Reverent. After the taping ended, several talents stayed late. They gathered in one of the locker rooms, lights dimmed, phones off, and they just shared stories. About the time Flair lit up a city with nothing but a robe and a promo. About the matches that defined eras. About his laugh, his energy, his refusal to ever truly slow down. For a moment, WWE wasn't a business. It was a family, grieving a reality none of them wanted to accept. Flair sat quietly in the corner, listening, smiling, holding back tears. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a story, but as we look at the events of that night, one thing becomes clear: Ric Flair is still fighting. And that's the part that both breaks your heart and inspires you. He's already begun treatment, aggressive, according to those close to him. The cancer isn't something he's ignoring. He's tackling it the only way he knows how, head-on, like a steel cage match with the odds stacked against him. He's told friends he doesn't want this to be the end. Not yet. He still believes there's more to give. More to live for. And perhaps one more left in him. Yet, behind the courage is a man who's tired. A man who's weathered more storms than any human should ever have to. Let's not forget, this is a man who lost a son to addiction. Who battled his own demons with alcohol. Who was declared medically dead once and still came back. Who lost fortunes, gained them again, and gave the world some of its most unforgettable wrestling moments in the process. But now, facing cancer, he's confronting a battle he can't chop block or suplex. He has to endure. And that's the hardest part. Some fans may wonder, why didn't WWE announce this publicly? Why wasn't there a press release? The answer lies in respect. Flair himself reportedly asked WWE not to turn this into a media frenzy. He didn't want to be the subject of sympathy posts or charity spotlights. He wanted strength. He wanted normalcy. And most of all, he wanted privacy. So, WWE honored that. They held their silence. They let the moment be his. Still, news has a way of escaping. A few whispers online, some cryptic tweets from wrestlers, and now, this heartbreaking update has begun to surface. The fans, those who grew up screaming, "Whoa," from their living rooms, are slowly beginning to learn the truth. And the reaction? Devastation. Concern. But also love. Endless love. Messages have poured in from around the world. Not just from wrestlers, but from people Flair inspired, athletes, actors, ordinary folks who once heard a promo of his and decided to fight harder in their own lives. And maybe that's Ric Flair's greatest gift. Not the titles. Not the promos. Not the robes or the jet-fueled lifestyle. But the resilience. The ability to stand when everything says stay down. To shout, "Whoa," in the face of death itself. And even now, as he sits with this diagnosis hanging over him like a shadow, he is doing exactly what made him a legend in the first place, refusing to give up. As this news ripples through the WWE universe, the air feels heavier. Fans are holding their breath. Friends are praying. And somewhere, in a quiet home in Georgia, Ric Flair is preparing for the fight of his life, not in the ring, but in a doctor's office. The nature boy is still here. Still styling. Still surviving. And if history has taught us anything, it's that counting Ric Flair out is the one mistake the world keeps making. The following morning, after the emotional night backstage, Ric Flair returned to his hotel suite, accompanied by an assistant WWE had quietly assigned to him. It wasn't out of pity, it was out of love. Because after what had happened, the company didn't want to take any chances. And Flair, who once danced through life with champagne in one hand and a Rolex on the other, now walked slowly, carefully, leaning on the shoulder of a young man who had grown up idolizing him. That image of the nature boy needing help just to reach the elevator broke more hearts than most fans will ever know, but what came next was even more sobering. The WWE's medical team arranged a full-scale consultation for Flair at a top cancer treatment center in Atlanta. This wasn't your average checkup. This was war. They assembled a team of oncologists, dermatologists, and cardiovascular specialists because with Flair's history, every move had to be precise. His heart couldn't handle another complication. His body, though strong in spirit, had been ravaged by decades of physical punishment, surgeries, and near-death experiences. And now it had to endure another round, this time against an invisible enemy. The early tests confirmed what Flair had feared. The skin cancer had progressed to an aggressive stage. Surgery was on the table, but so was chemotherapy. Both options came with risks, especially for a man his age with his health profile. Backstage, the WWE community didn't just move on. They carried Ric with them. Even in the weeks that followed, tributes began appearing quietly during shows, camera pans on fans wearing Ric Flair shirts, subtle references from commentators, and even wrestlers mimicking his strut or throwing a signature "whoa" before landing a chop. It was subtle, but it was there. Because the moment the locker room learned of his diagnosis, a silent oath was made. Ric Flair would not go through this alone. Charlotte Flair, his daughter and WWE superstar in her own right, was reportedly devastated. Sources close to her say she took some time off to be with her father, traveling between cities and hospital appointments. For years, Charlotte carried her father's legacy with pride and purpose, walking in his footsteps while building her own name. But now she was simply a daughter watching her hero suffer. She didn't issue any public statements. She didn't cry on camera. But those who know her say she broke down in private more than once. And even in the quiet moments, when she'd sit beside Ric's hospital bed, holding his hand, she never stopped believing in his fight. In an unrecorded, deeply personal conversation between Charlotte and a veteran WWE referee who visited the hospital, she reportedly whispered, "He's not done yet. He just needs time." That sentiment echoed throughout the wrestling world. Not done yet. Those words became a quiet chant backstage, an invisible lifeline as Ric's condition continued to evolve. Meanwhile, Ric himself tried to maintain some form of normalcy. Friends say he insisted on watching WWE shows, sitting up in bed to critique promos, match pacing, and finishes. He'd shake his head at certain gimmicks, laugh out loud when someone nailed a promo, and even tried to cut a mock backstage segment from his hospital bed, ending, of course, with his iconic "whoa." It was classic Flair. Defiant. Even joyful in pain. It reminded everyone that while his body might be weakening, his spirit was as strong as ever. Still, the treatment began taking its toll. Radiation therapy, designed to target the cancer, left him exhausted. His appetite dropped. He began losing more weight. And for someone so iconic for his presence and flamboyance, seeing himself withered in the mirror was one of the hardest pills to swallow. According to one source close to the Flair family, Ric once stood silently in front of the bathroom mirror for nearly 5 minutes, barely recognizing himself. The man who once said, "To be the man, you gotta beat the man," was now fighting to remember what that man even looked like. And yet, he never asked, "Why me?" That's the part that moved everyone who came in contact with him. Flair didn't wallow. He didn't lash out. He didn't ask what he had done to deserve this. Instead, he focused on others. On those who were hurting for him. On how Charlotte was holding up. On how the fans might react when they eventually heard the full story. In one conversation with a former tag team partner who called him late one night, Ric reportedly said, "If this is the end, then I'm going out swinging, not crying." Flair, ever the fighter, responded with a smirk and said, "Then don't let them bury me before I'm gone." That line hit everyone who heard it like a punch to the chest, and it speaks to something greater. Ric Flair isn't done. Not in spirit. Not in heart. His legacy isn't just in championships or robes or catchphrases. It's in how he endures. In how he inspires even while his body betrays him. In how he continues to show up for the people and the business he loves, even if it's just through a text, a call, or a glance from a hospital room television. The WWE locker room has begun planning a tribute for Flair. Nothing official, nothing flashy, but something organic. A night where current stars will pay homage through their entrances, their moves, their promos. Some are calling it Flair Night, while others simply refer to it as the Woo Show. Regardless of what it becomes, one thing is clear: the man who gave his all to wrestling will be honored while he's still here to feel it. And that, more than anything, is what he deserves. Outside the ring, fans have begun organizing their own tributes. Posters have gone up. Fan art is flooding social media. Wrestling podcasts are doing retrospective episodes dedicated to Flair's best moments. And some die-hard fans are even organizing a virtual Woo Chain, a coordinated global event where fans in different time zones will scream "Whoa" at a designated time, creating a wave of love that circles the world for the Nature Boy. Because no matter where you come from or how long you've been watching wrestling, if you know the sport, you know Ric Flair. And yet, even amid all this love, there is still fear. The fear that maybe this battle won't end in victory. The fear that time, finally, has caught up to the man who once seemed immortal. And that's a hard truth for wrestling fans to face. Because losing Ric Flair, whether physically or symbolically, feels like losing a part of childhood. A part of history. A part of magic that may never exist in quite the same way again, but Ric Flair has always lived on the edge of disaster and glory. That's his legacy. That's his myth. And now, in the face of this terrifying diagnosis, he's proving once again that no matter how dark it gets, there is always a reason to fight. A reason to smile. A reason to say, whoa. He may be 76. He may be sick. But Ric Flair is still here. Still giving. Still living. And that, more than any belt or promo or record, is the legacy he leaves behind. In the days that followed the devastating backstage reveal, WWE entered a kind of quiet mourning, not a public declaration of grief, but a subtle, communal heartbreak that hung over every show, every match, every promo. Superstars weren't just performing, they were carrying the weight of a reality none of them were ready for. Ric Flair, the symbol of survival, the man whose resilience became the foundation of pro wrestling storytelling, was now facing an opponent that no steel chair or figure-4 leg lock could defeat. And although he wasn't in the ring anymore, his shadow loomed larger than ever. Backstage segments became more emotional. Veteran talent and production crew spoke in hushed tones, checking their phones for updates on Flair's treatment, whispering stories they hadn't told in years. There was a sense of unity, of solemnity, that hadn't been felt in the company in a long time. Even the younger generation, those who had never shared a locker room with Flair, felt it. Braun Breaker, himself a second-generation star and the nephew of Flair's longtime friend Rick Steiner, was said to have paused mid-interview rehearsal, caught off guard by the gravity of what Flair represented. "He's wrestling royalty," he reportedly muttered, "and now we're all praying for the king." Triple H, who had known Flair for decades, began working on a long-term tribute video, separate from the in-ring acknowledgement being discussed. This wasn't for television ratings. It wasn't for WrestleMania. It was something deeper, an archive, a living eulogy of sorts, designed to be shown to Rick while he was still here to appreciate it. A documentary crew, previously assigned to a separate project, was redirected to begin compiling unseen footage, locker room stories, and unseen moments of Flair's laughter, his fire, and his fearlessness. What WWE was creating wasn't just content, it was preservation. An act of love, but while the WWE machine moved behind the scenes to honor Flair, the man himself remained focused on something far more intimate, staying alive. Doctors had outlined a painful, uncertain path ahead. The melanoma on his shoulder had spread into deeper layers of skin and was dangerously close to vital lymph nodes. Surgery was no longer just an option, it was a necessity. The risk, however, was that due to Flair's heart condition, anesthesia posed an enormous threat. Just one misstep in the ore and the man who survived plane crashes and comas could flatline on the table. But Rick, as always, didn't blink. "Let's get it out," he told the surgical team, according to a nurse who was in the room. "I've been cut open before. I'm not scared of a scar." Charlotte was at his side that morning. She held his hand until they wheeled him away, placing her father's Hall of Fame ring in his palm just before the doors closed. "So you remember who you are," she said, fighting back tears. And then she waited. For hours. Then 5. Then 6. Until finally, the surgeon emerged with cautious optimism. The tumor had been removed. Margins looked clean. But they would need to test the surrounding tissue to know for sure. Flair was stable, but weak. Still, when he regained consciousness, the first thing he did was attempt to raise 2 fingers in the air and say, barely audible, "Woo." It wasn't the loud, defiant scream fans were used to. It was more like a whisper of resistance. But to Charlotte, to the nurses, to everyone who had doubted he would survive the surgery, it might as well have been a war cry. Ric Flair had made it through another near-death moment. But this one had taken more out of him than all the others combined. WWE, hearing the news, collectively exhaled. Texts flew through backstage chats. Cody Rhodes reportedly got emotional during a post-show meeting. Edge, on a break from in-ring competition, posted a cryptic Instagram story featuring a photo of him and Flair from years ago with the caption, "He's still the man." And perhaps most poignantly, an anonymous source claimed that Vince McMahon himself, long absent from the public WWE scene, sent a handwritten letter to Rick, delivered privately, with just 3 words, "Still unbeatable, pal." Meanwhile, fans across the world began organizing something extraordinary. Using Reddit and Twitter, a group of die-hard supporters launched the Nature Boy Candlelight Campaign, an initiative calling on fans to light a candle at home on Sunday night at 8:16 p.m., symbolizing Flair's 16 World Championships. The idea went viral. Thousands participated, sharing videos and photos under the hashtag #WooferFlair. WWE even acknowledged the movement subtly during Raw, with the commentary team saying, "This one's for the man who made us all believe," right before a commercial break. The message was clear: Ric Flair mattered. Not just for what he did in the ring, but for how he lived outside of it. But as the world celebrated his survival, Flair himself remained locked in a new kind of struggle, the emotional toll of recovery. Chemotherapy followed the surgery. The doctors explained that although the tumor was gone, they needed to be aggressive to ensure no microscopic remnants remained. The treatment drained him. He began to lose his appetite again. His skin, always famously tanned and glowing under arena lights, now looked pale and dry. His hair thinned. And in moments of solitude, when the hospital room was quiet and the fans weren't cheering, Ric Flair faced something he'd avoided for 76 years. Silence. He'd always been the center of noise, of attention, of chaos. But now, staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., listening to the soft hum of machines, Flair began to reflect. On the friends he'd lost. On the matches he never got to finish. On the sons he couldn't save. On the marriages that fell apart. On the nights he couldn't remember because of the drinks. There was a depth of pain he had buried for years beneath his iconic persona. But now, alone and still, those memories came back with force. Yet, even then, he didn't crumble. He did what Ric Flair has always done. He processed it, then pushed forward. Journalists began reaching out to WWE, hoping to secure the first exclusive about Flair's diagnosis. But WWE declined every single one. They released no official statements. Flair had asked for silence, and silence he received. Only those closest to him were allowed into the circle. And yet, somehow, word kept spreading. More fans learned. More tributes poured in. And as more people heard, something beautiful began to take shape, a collective outpouring of gratitude from a generation that grew up believing in Ric Flair. Some fans wrote poems. Others painted murals in their towns. A group in Mexico staged a wrestling event entirely in tribute to Flair's legacy. One of the main events was titled "To Be the Man." Every wrestler wore a robe. Every promo ended with a woo. Flair saw the footage from his hospital bed and, according to nurses, cried quietly for nearly 10 minutes. Not out of sadness, but because he realized, perhaps for the first time, just how much he meant to people. Not just as a performer, but as a symbol of fighting through pain and never giving up. And that, ultimately, is the core of Ric Flair's story. He is more than a 16-time world champion. More than a flamboyant persona. More than the sum of his scandals or his surgeries. He is, at his essence, a man who refused to die when the world told him it was time. And now, in the fight of his life, that same energy is pushing him forward. One day at a time. One treatment at a time. One small woo at a time. Back in Stamford, WWE executives began planning a special tribute event to air the night before WrestleMania, a pre-show documentary titled Legacy, the Ric Flair story. Narrated by several of his closest peers and protégés, the special would walk fans through his real-life journey, from humble beginnings to global superstardom, all the way to his current battle. "We're not eulogizing," one producer was quoted saying, "we're celebrating while he's still with us." He deserves to hear the cheers. And he will. Because Ric Flair, whether in a hospital gown or a custom suit, is still the man. In the weeks that followed the surgery and initial rounds of treatment, Ric Flair's recovery became a slow, excruciating climb. He wasn't just battling cancer, he was fighting the creeping sense that the world was already beginning to move on without him. Even with the outpouring of support and love, the silence between visits, the moments when Charlotte had to leave to fulfill her own WWE commitments, and the hushed way nurses tiptoed around his hospital room. All of it built a quiet pressure in his chest that no doctor could treat. For a man who had spent his life at the center of attention, the sudden stillness felt almost more painful than the illness. But Flair, even in those darkest hours, refused to be buried by loneliness. One night, as rain pelted the windows of his recovery suite in Atlanta, he reportedly called Shawn Michaels just to talk. Not about wrestling. Not about what he was going through. But about God. About redemption. About how, in the silence of that hospital, he had started praying again, not as the nature boy, but as Richard Morgan Flair, the boy from Tennessee who just wanted to feel whole. The conversation was said to have lasted nearly 2 hours. When it ended, both men were in tears. And in that moment, it became clear, Ric Flair was not just fighting cancer, he was healing parts of himself he'd ignored for decades. News of Flair's quiet spiritual journey began to ripple through the locker room, not through press releases or rumors, but through whispers. And in a surprising twist, it started to unify even the most unlikely of WWE personalities. Randy Orton, who had once been mentored by Flair during the Evolution era, reportedly reached out for the first time in over a year. Becky Lynch sent a handwritten letter thanking him for his contributions to women's wrestling, recalling a time he had told her backstage, "Don't let them box you in, sweetheart. Be bigger than the cage." Even Roman Reigns, busy with his own storyline and title reign, paused during a production meeting to share a story about the time Flair pulled him aside and said, "You're not the future. You're already it." For a moment, the entire WWE universe paused to remember who Ric Flair really was, not just the persona, but the pillar. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, WWE continued its tribute project, now taking the form of an 8-part documentary series. Each part would highlight a different era of Flair's life, his rise in the NWA, his dominance in WCW, the controversies, the retirements, the comebacks, the heartbreak, and now the fight. The team combed through hundreds of hours of old footage. They reached out to old rivals like Ricky Steamboat, Dusty Rhodes' family, Hulk Hogan, and even Bret Hart. And the most powerful voice of all? Charlotte. For the first time, she agreed to sit down on camera and tell the story. Not just of Ric Flair the icon, but Ric Flair the father. Her interview, according to one producer, left the entire studio crew in tears. "There were moments," she said, "when I hated what wrestling took from him. From us. But now I see that it gave him the fight he needs to survive this." She spoke of nights when her dad would come home bleeding, exhausted, but still smiling. Of the sound of the crowd through the TV. Of the way he'd light up when fans recognized him at the grocery store, even years after retirement. He never needed a stage, she said. He just needed people to believe in him. And believe. They did. As his strength began to slightly improve, Flair requested something few expected. He wanted to walk back into a WWE arena, not to perform, not to address the crowd, but simply to feel the energy again. Medical staff warned him it was risky. But Flair was adamant. "Let me feel the ropes one more time," he said. "Just once." WWE obliged, organizing a private, after-hours walkthrough.